You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis Podcast. Yeah, what advice would you have for producers that live in states where the labs aren't doing the sampling? They're having to do the sampling themselves, and they want to try to have an honest representation of their batches. What kind of advice could you give them as far as trying to do the best sampling they can do to get the most representative results for their batch, rather than a sort of doctored sample?
Well, first of all, you're going to need like some real management commitment that's what they want, right? Because when there's mandatory required testing and your competitors are hand selecting samples for the purposes of getting
the highest
what
value
they want on the lab report,
right?
That's not falsification of data, but it might be, sample
toes into manipulation,
sample manipulation, or, it's non-representative, if you will, of the bulk commodity. So, their management of whatever this company X that we're talking about really needs to be committed that that's what they want. And that's actually normal stuff in a dietary supplement and even pharmaceutical or even food manufacturing.
I mean, just basic agricultural testing. Like some of my experiences before getting into cannabis was, I was doing work with the BLM in seed collection, and we'd go visit, all of these huge farms that were collecting seed, and they'd have to get seed tested for different things, and dealing with very large batches, and they'd run into these same issues of trying to get representative sampling and testing and everything for commerce.
Right. I mean, the ketchup factory is not sorting through their ketchup to find like the sweetest little jar. They want one that they're going to send off that's exactly like the batch.
Right.
And there is a lot of value to that in a company. There's brand stability and product quality and consistency, but there's also manufacturing and cost control benefits to really wanting homogeneous production and sampling. So assuming a manufacturer is looking to have this level of quality, there's a few different standards out there. I believe the FDA has some guidelines for sampling for natural products.
They do. The WHO does.
The WHO also has guidelines for sampling. I think herbal medicines or something like that, or plant derived medicines, and they're roughly the same. I mean, it's kind of an algorithm that you must select some level of risk that you're willing to take, which would guide like how many sort of increments you would take from your batch. There's also some statistical variable for the number of containers that your batch is in. And then there's a variable for what tests you're getting, how much material the lab would actually need.
Yeah.
If they're running a battery of tests, one increment might be, 10 or 20 grams of something.
Right.
And so, I would start with guidelines like that. And I'd mentioned risk, like with herbal products, what are the risks? Is that it goes both ways, right? If you want to buy a train car full of echinacea to make a dietary supplement, there's risks to your quality control of your product. So you probably want to make sure that it doesn't have things like metals or microbial contamination, dust and filth and stuff like that. But then, on the manufacturing side, there's also some other risks that you want to manage with your sampling and testing, and that probably relates to like maybe what we would call the potency or the quality of that echinacea. If you want to make a standardized product, you need to benchmark how much alkalamide content is in your echinacea bulk material before you start putting it in bottles. So you take into account those things, and then work out this matrix for sampling. It'll tell you basically how many increments and from where in the container. Maybe it's not a carload, maybe it's a 55-gallon drum or something like that. It's not super complex. Definitely can be managed, and almost no dietary supplement or nutraceutical manufacturers are forced by a regulatory body to get a third party to come and do sampling.
They just require that it's statistically sound, as far as like GMP rules.
Right.
It's a very basic statement in there, but it's like, and that's why they have those guidelines from the FDA about that, and that's kind of where the what is it? 1 plus the square root of n comes from. It's one of their recommended sampling plans.
I completely understand where regulators are coming from in states where they're requiring cannabis labs to physically perform the sample collection as an independent third party. I think I understand the motivations for that, but honestly, like as a business owner and manager, it's kind of something I wish that the cannabis and hemp industry would sort of take up on their own, just like the dietary supplement and pharmaceutical industry, because it's really just a practical reason. I mean, at the laboratory, we focus on making a laboratory a business, and there's all sorts of things that we need to figure out to make that a business. Same thing in other business, cost control, training, and there's a certain level of skills and things that us scientists and chemists understand and spend a lot of time and have expertise in, and that's how to make a business of a technical operation like realizing data in a laboratory. And to add the need for that business to also have
a sampling business,
and it's a completely separate business that's like not exactly in a lot of chemistry and lab guys' repertoire, because it involves logistics, scheduling and driving and maps, and so it's a weird thing to have to add to your lab business. It's not typical, I would say.
Yeah. I totally agree. It was something that when I was doing some of that work, I hated. It's
fairly costly, and we have to pass that cost on to clients. I mean,
right. And going back to something you said of wishing that the cannabis industry, whether it be hemp or medical or recreational markets, would kind of take that upon themselves. My hope is that I can see right now regulators are super nervous in general about cannabis, the cannabis industry's, going public and, being legal and everything. And they're putting these really tight, in some states, putting these really tight controls on them. And my hope is that after a few years, some of that will kind of calm down and start to settle into more normal, GMP, type operations. And that'll take a while, because a lot of cannabis companies are going through a huge learning curve right now, because they've either been operating in the black market and are trying to come into the legal market and get acquainted with all of these rules. I mean, a lot of consulting I do with clients around GMP, or even like ISO accreditation for labs, this stuff is super new to them as far as just understanding what the FDA expects, and understanding that, like, in Oregon, the Oregon Department of Ag, when they're looking at food production facilities and everything, they are acting on behalf of the FDA, doing that work. And the FDA contracts them out to do FDA inspections. And I think that's something that people don't realize, is that your state regulatory bodies, we always think of like, well, the FDA is this thing, and then, the Department of Ag for the state is this. And, the FDA just contracts a lot of that work out to the state agencies. And so having really good relationships with your auditors, food safety inspectors, all that sort of thing, can go a really long way. And my experience is that a lot of regulators are excited to help teach cannabis companies about these quality standards and typical business practices. They want to see businesses in their states do well and be a good example of how to do things. And so while I think it's largely a consequence of coming out of the black market or these gray markets, that there's a lot of apprehension about regulators, auditors, and that sort of thing. But I really encourage people to actually get to know your regulators and people with like the Department of Ag and everything that are going to be doing these inspections on behalf of the FDA. They can give you a lot of basically free consulting, honestly, if you just ask them questions. And
it's true. And if you leave all those stones unturned, they will get to know you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you'll be interacting with them one way or another. It's much better to establish an early relationship and let them know you're trying to make an honest effort to do things as best you can.